into the UK's involvement in the Iraqi invasion and war was published today. The inquiry looked into Britain's involvement into the war between 2001 and 2009 and the legitimacy thereof. Well, our UK correspondent, that's Dan Whitehead, joins us live from London now. Good afternoon, Dan. Blair very clearly back in the hot seat, but what are his real prospects of going before the International Criminal Court? Some legal analysts here just calling it a legal impossibility for now.
Yes, and I think that's the message which is being heard here, but under no doubt Tony Blair is under the grill and under the spotlight here. As we speak, he's continuing to give a full statement, his reaction to the findings from Sir John Chilcot, and they include the message that the decision to go and take the UK into war in Iraq in 2003 was the hardest, most relentless decision that I took as Prime Minister. And he went on to say that the amount of sorrow, regret and apology, you may never know how much I expressed that. And that is a message which Tony Blair has been pushing here. He says he takes full responsibility for those decisions, but said that he made the decision in good faith. In terms of the legality, it's keen to stress that this report was not looking at the specific legality of the war. There are some mootings in Westminster just across the way here about an impeachment process against Tony Blair, some sort of trial within Parliament, but all that would result is for him not to be able to hold office. It hasn't been used for hundreds of years, that rule, and of course Tony Blair does not hold office anymore. So that prospect at the moment is unlikely, despite the high level of criticism being pointed at the former Prime Minister. Although standing here in Parliament Square, the site of many demonstrations, there are people with placards here who are calling for Tony Blair to face war crimes.
And you just preempted my next question. How is the report going down there with anti-war protests? There was a big rally planned for Westminster today. They're insisting that the report will be a whitewash if it fails to declare Blair's involvement illegal, no matter how remorseful he might seem now.
Well, I think it's far from a whitewash, and you're right, that has been what had been expected from some of the anti-war protesters and many other analysts saying that Tony Blair would be let off the hook here. That hasn't happened, and this is a comprehensive report. As you mentioned in your package there, some 2.5 million words. It'll take analysts quite some time to plough through all of the detail, but there is, and there will always remain, anger from those families of the soldiers who died and those anti-war protesters, many of them of course tens of thousands who took to the street in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq to protest against such an invasion. There are many who will just simply not feel that the report is ever adequate enough. That remains to be seen if there's any legal proceedings which are taken either against the former Prime Minister, currently looking unlikely, but even soldiers, British soldiers who fought in that war and their actions which they took. But looking at the detail of the report from Sir John Chilcot, especially looking at the communications between former Prime Minister Blair and President Bush, it's very telling to see what was said between the two. There was a declassified letter which Prime Minister Tony Blair had written to George Bush saying that he would be with Bush whatever, and that was written 8 months before the invasion began. So clearly there was a backing from the Prime Minister to George Bush. Exactly what we read into that needs to be looked into for some time, and people will be digging through that detail, as will legal teams, to see if there's any justification for legal action going forward.
Dan, the ICC in recent years has come under very heavy criticism for being biased against and targeting African leaders. So clearly now an opportunity perhaps for the International Court to show the same speed and the same zeal when it comes to European leaders.
Yes. That will be the message certainly coming out of Africa and the international community as a whole. The ICC continuing to face issues of bias towards African leaders and conflicts over there. Whether or not that, they will say that should not impact any decision making as to whether action needs to be taken in this case here. That remains to be seen, but there's no doubt that that'll put some pressure on Tony Blair and on those implicated within the Iraq war and the decisions going forward. But I stress that this inquiry was not making a legal decision on whether or not the war was illegal or any suggestions or recommendations whether or not legal action should be taken. It was looking at lessons which could be learnt for future governments, and it was also highly critical of the plans post-conflict. In fact, Sir John Chilcot said the preparations were wholly inadequate in terms of just what the preparations were post the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, and that'll be really one of the main lessons going forward, looking at the intelligence which led to the invasion, especially the weapons of mass destruction claim, which the justification, Sir John Chilcot said, simply could not be justified, and that there were flaws in those intelligence, and also the post-conflict preparation, which simply in this case didn't exist. And Tony Blair taking responsibility in the speech that he's making at the moment, saying that he takes that responsibility, he admits that there were errors, especially in the post-war planning, and those are the real lessons going forward, which any future governments considering military action involved in the UK will have to heed.
Dan Whitehead, thank you for your time on the SABC News Desk. He's joining us live there from London.